The saga around Stephen's Green shopping centre rumbles on, producing plenty of column inches, strong words, and protest on the streets. And it's unusual when a proposed development does that in Dublin. The replacement has been described colourfully in many places, but Roy Curtis in The Star takes the gold medal for depressing, dull, unimaginative, featureless, and dreary. A slice of blah. Andrea Horan argued in the journal.ie that perhaps the hostility towards the new design for the shopping centre is better understood in a broader context, writing that I do think the frustration is cumulative and Dublin citizens are worn out from the assault of lowest common design that swept across the city. Now, I am broadly a great admirer of O'Donnell and Toomey architects, and they are architects who think about context. I love, for example, their work on the Gallery of Photography, where they note the large-scale window is the central organising element of the design, symbolising the camera lens and operating as a screen for films and photographs projected from the photography archive across the square. Next time you're in Meeting House Square, have a look at it and you'll see what they were doing there. I also love the work they did at the Irish Film Centre, or now the IFI. That really was no easy task, incorporating the old, which was a religious meeting house, and the new. But I consider that project, the IFI, masterful. I like the Sean O'Casey Centre down in the East Wall too, although it's a divisive one. But the Stephen's Green Shopping Centre has been a project wrapped up in controversy. The Heritage Council, calling on the city to refuse planning permission, noted that they are not convinced that the proposed rejuvenation of the shopping centre will have a positive impact on the historic streetscape of this part of Dublin. The shopping centre stands at a very important historic location, built on the footprint of not alone the Dandelion Market, but the famed Rice's Bar and more besides. And its construction was in itself a really long, drawn-out saga. I mean, the word blitz was used in the Evening Herald describing that corner. In the summer of 1986, they told their readers, it resembled a scene from the Blitz, but it saw the passing of another era in Dublin's history. The 4-acre site on the South King Street corner of Stephen's Green is earmarked for a major new shopping centre, but right now it resembles a bomb site. Buildings have been levelled, and Dubliners look on as another pile of their city is heaped into trucks by demolition crews. A lot of real substance was lost there in the 1980s to build a shopping centre, and what now would seem like a relatively short lifespan. There are things about that shopping centre that I like, and we'll get into that today, from the impressive clock from Stokes of Cork, the leaders in their field, to the presence of art on its top floor. There are also things about it that I find pretty baffling, layout-wise, and anyone in a hurry to the jacks can attest to that as well. I should be completely honest and say I was somewhat taken aback by the level of public feeling on the centre and its proposed replacement. Getting back to Andrea's piece in the journal, I do suspect she's right, and it's opposition to the new proposal as much as sentimentality for the existing one that's motivated a lot of that. In the Irish Times, Frank MacDonald, eternal thorn in the side of developers in the capital, and previously on this podcast and hopefully on it again, he opted for the title Killing Kitsch with Blandness. So let's take a look at the history of the site today. Before getting into this, a quick ask of you, dear listener. If you haven't, please do take a second to rate the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. The algorithm war is very much going the other way at present and just doesn't suit independent podcasts that don't get the same kind of natural promotion, but it really does boost things when people leave comments or ratings. I'm aware that some ads have been popping up in the Apple feed via Lipson, the podcast host, and I'm doing everything I can to get rid of those. It should have been a simple opt-out, but there seems to be a few hoops to jump through there. So I think they're gone on Spotify, but people subscribing on various platforms really helps. And if the ads made you unsubscribe, just know they'll be gone ASAP. I don't want ads on or around the podcast, which is supported instead by its listeners on Patreon. But getting back to that earlier point, a quick rating is worth an awful lot to the algorithm, one of the words of our lives in recent times. For now, let's get into this edition. Grafton Street, like many retail streets, is one we normally pass through quickly on our way somewhere else. It has some great architectural moments, though. There's Bewley's Oriental Cafe at 78 and 79, completed in the 1920s and described as a rare example of the Egyptian revival style in Ireland. I love the mosaic detail, the windows. A favourite too was on the corner, what's now a corner shop at number 52. Some call it Gaiety Corner, others with longer memories, Noblet's Corner, in reference to the old sweet shop that was there. But I love that building. I love the Art Deco nature of it, the distinctive tower on top. You could really get a look of it from across the street. John Robinson, the senior partner in the firm that built that corner building, championed new architectural style, new approaches, had little time for any nostalgic longing for the past. David Dixon quotes him as saying, "The Georgian era is over and there's little sense in seeking to perpetuate it." Grafton Street is a great street to walk down because you get everything there. The presence of buskers really is part of the identity of the street now. And you'd sometimes forget that it was only permanently pedestrianised in 1982. Going back more than a decade earlier, they began trialling pedestrianisation of the street in September 1971. But it'd be very hard now to imagine cars going up and down Grafton Street. Walking up Grafton Street, for me, from College Green to the top of the street, walking up Grafton Street brings you to Fusiliers Arch, bullet-splattered memorial to the Royal Dublin Fusiliers of the Second Boer War on one side, and the shopping centre on the other. And if the building that now houses the newsagents was built by an architect who saw little sense in evoking the past, well, what about the shopping centre? There seems very little agreement even on what it is evoking. To the website GPS My City, this unmistakable steamboat-shaped shopping centre has been a landmark since its inauguration. They say it was inspired by the architecture of London's Crystal Palace. The journalist and writer Eva Barry has described the building, noting the exterior is 1980s, does Victoriana. That the proposed replacement of the shopping centre is so controversial is a reminder that actually it was a controversial intervention in the city. And describing it in the contemporary press as a £50 million retail gamble by developers British Land, the centre was seen as a punt, on Grafton Street more broadly. Explaining the logic behind the big shopping centre, British Land noted, with 54,000 shoppers a day, Grafton Street is an essential part of the shopping life of Dubliners with the most disposable income. Market research into Dublin shopping patterns conducted in the last month, readers of one paper were told, shows that Grafton Street shoppers are more likely to own a compact disc player, a microwave oven, and holiday abroad, compared with Dubliners as a whole. 4 out of 5 shoppers in the street were said to be women, the prime target for most retail activities, and the age profile of the street was overwhelmingly young. The centre was a joint project between British Lands and Power Securities, who put their faith in the architect James Toomey, who had worked on other projects like the Powerscourt Townhouse and Manchester's Royal Exchange Centre. Toomey, readers of one paper were told, was a real stickler for detail. Loath to use new timber in an old building, in the case of the Powerscourt Townhouse, he managed to locate antique pine floorboards for the balconies and floors. They came as salvage material from an old malt house knocked down by Guinness. But the late 1980s was perhaps considered the golden age of the shopping mall in the United States. And people internationally were thinking about how we shop. Rich Cohen describes it in the Wall Street Journal. In the 1980s, malls weren't just planters and parking lots, but ways of life. In 1982, the mall meant freedom. You were dropped off at noon and picked up at dusk. In the hours between, you were left to roam in the preferred fashion, in a teenage pack. But the mall in the US and the shopping centre in Britain, they both had enormously negative impacts on towns. They shifted the entire axis of population centres often to the margins. The mom and pop store, as they say in America, suffered greatly. But Stephen's Green was something else entirely, being in the heart of the city. There had been shopping centres built before in the city, but the scale of it, with over twice the floor space of the ILAC, which had also been very controversial. The ILAC was the death knell for many small market streets around Moore Street. I think the scale of the Stephen's Green shopping centre and its location both made it a subject of fascination in the years before opening. Well, the centre was built in about 2 years, which really is no small achievement. The work of acquiring more than 160 leases on South King Street and Stephen's Green had gone on far, far longer and involved several big names in the story of Dublin property and real estate. The Slazengers, owners of the Powerscourt estate, spent some 15 years acquiring properties on the corner that would later house the shopping centre, and they eventually sold the site for a cool £10.5 million to businessman and developer Patrick Gallagher in 1980, and unfortunately, that was not long before the collapse of the Gallagher Group. And in the pages of Hibernia magazine, which like to keep an eye on the developers, Gallagher was described as one of the midnight cowboys associated with the destruction of Dublin. At the time of his group's collapse, the Indo told readers that Gallagher was the property sector's most colourful personality, known in the marketplace as a trader. He bought and sold like any other trader, but his product was a spectacular item called property, and the sums involved were numbered in the tens of millions. In the end, with the collapse of the Gallagher Group, the site reverted back to the Slazengers, who sold it for about half the earlier sum to the developers of the shopping centre. So there was, developers considered, a sort of meow on the site, and an extraordinary array of things had previously occupied parts of it, most famously the Dandelion Market. As Rory Egan described it, the Dandelion Market was a total break with all that had come before it. At the time, Dubliners bought their shirts in Clearys and trousers in Arnott's. The Dandelion offered tie-dye t-shirts, he wrote. Originally located in Pembroke Lane and founded by Eamon Cannon, it took its inspiration from the kind of markets found elsewhere on continental Europe. This wasn't like Moore Street, a place where you went to buy fruit and veg. This was a place of bric-a-brac, antique furniture, vinyl records, and more. It opened in 1970, and Eamon described it himself.
I've travelled a great deal, travelled around Europe and around the Near and Far East, and we thought there were so many open-air markets all over that we've been frustrated for a long time, I feel, in Dublin about open-air markets generally. So we decided, why not open one this year in Dublin?
That market would move in time to Leeson Close before eventually finding a happy home. And as Egan wrote, before long they had outgrown that site, Leeson Close, and in 1973 they moved to the former Taylor Keep bottling plant in St Stephen's Green, where the shopping centre now stands. Using the old stables, mews and courtyard, the market doubled in size, with many of the stalls as permanent fixtures and most of it indoors. Just like in the case of Temple Bar, the Dandelion Market kind of thrived in the confusion of the developers. In Temple Bar, old industrial and warehouse buildings became the accidental backdrop of a cultural quarter as plans to demolish the area for a bus station just stalled and stalled. But similar things were happening around Stephen's Green and South King Street. At the old bottling plant, the Dandelion thrived as buildings around it closed. The Dando, as Dubliners remember it, was a key part of the Dublin youth of so many, and as Ronnie sang it had everything.
There's shops and there's stalls of all kinds down the lane. In the Dandelion Market, sure nothing's the same. Buy some waffles and fill them with jam. There's a gypsy and she'll read your palm. There are boots and there's plenty of clogs to fit all the shapes that ever was.
Gigs were a feature of the Dandelion Market. U2 played it no fewer than 8 times in sets loaded with tracks like Out of Control and Stories for Boys. That early, great kind of post-punk sounding U2. Crucially, the venue didn't have a bar, meaning that concerts were all ages and accessible. And these afternoon gigs at the Dando were formative for a lot of people. Christy Dignam remembered it. Discovering weird and wonderful stuff at the Dandelion was a huge chunk of my youth. He remembered going along to gigs every Saturday afternoon. Local bands had a bit of a following or being built up as maybe the next big thing. A lot of the time you came away saying, I could do better than that. And at least to his credit, Christy did. By the early 1980s though, the Dando was in some decline, and the evening press really didn't hold back in 1981. An Aladdin's cave of all that is brash, bogus and rubbishy. They noted, insisting that many solid citizens of Dublin will rejoice in the destruction of the Dandelion Market. They feel about the Dandelion Market as the poet John Betjeman felt about Slough. Come gentle bombs and fall on Slough, it isn't fit for humans now. Another columnist struck a more sane note. And the Dandelion Market is no more. It's sad to see a piece of Dublin's diminishing street life pass away to make room for another faceless lump of concrete. And while that sentiment was right, The shopping centre that would eventually emerge was to prove anything but a faceless lump of concrete. Harder to shift, though, than the Dandelion Market were some of the other tenants around the green at South King Street. Rice's Pub, for example, situated at what is now literally the entrance to the shopping centre, would cost the developers £750,000 in 1985, which is no small sum of money for a pub that wasn't doing particularly well by then. Time, gentlemen, please, the headline that one newspaper opted for. Rice's, like the nearby Bartley Duns, was a kind of gay-friendly public house. Micheál MacLeamore and Hilton Edwards, Dublin's most recognisable gay couple, were regular customers at Bobby Rice's establishment in its heyday. And it was a kind of traditional pub in layout and design. Also lost in the name of progress was Sinnott's on South King Street, though another pub now carries the same name. Eugene Wilson, the owner of Sinnott's, held out until a final take-it-or-leave-it offer, as it was described in the press, arrived from British Land's solicitors. The only good thing for me and people who love the old Sinnott's, the journalist John Boland wrote, is that the marvellous marble bar counter and most of the rest of the interior are to be kept intact. And some hoped that Sinnott's interior could actually be incorporated into the shopping centre in some way. That might sound a bit mad, but if you've been on the continent, it's not actually all that unusual to find pubs inside of retail spaces. But whatever people felt about what was lost on the Green and South King Street, Toomey's shopping centre was closely followed at every stage of construction and development in the press. And in fact, not even the look of the shopping centre, but who's in it and who isn't. There was a great high street war, as there often was in those days, with reports that Dunnes Stores, who ultimately took a third of the available space, did everything in their power to keep arch-rival Super Quinn out. Behind the green and white hoarding on the corner of Stephen's Green and South King Street, one newspaper wrote in 1987, the country's biggest ever shopping centre is taking shape. Under the watchful eye of architectural chief Mr. James Toomey, the first section of ornate wrought iron balustrade, carefully copied from its Georgian original, has been lifted into place 3 stories up on the facade. Toomey, true to form, was conscious of the historic environment of the building, so on South King Street, he insisted the building's red brick was designed to complement the neighbouring Gaiety Theatre. And there's also a reminder that the building opened in 1988, the very distinctive 1988 Millennium Castles, which we love around these parts. Red, yellow and blue, that's kind of very modernist, kind of stacked on top of each other castles. There's a lovely mosaic of that to be found in the brickwork on South King Street. That's one detail I really hope is preserved, moved elsewhere even, should redevelopment go ahead. And there are all kinds of reminders of 1988 on the streets of Dublin, including, not least of all, Monty Malone. Some insisted Toomey was trying to pay homage to Turner's great palm house in the National Botanic Gardens. Frank MacDonald mentioned this, commenting at the time of the centre's opening that it also resembled a Mississippi riverboat, which had somehow become stranded on the edge of St. Stephen's Green without its paddle wheel. And actually, that idea of the centre as a riverboat probably goes back to that comment. And whatever about evoking the great palm house, MacDonald felt Toomey couldn't resist adding more and more royal icing to his confection. There was maybe just too much going on. Some of the features of the centre that I really do like include its really impressive clock. Certainly one of the largest of its kind in Ireland, and sometimes said to be one of the largest of its kind in Europe, which unsurprisingly comes from the Stoke family firm in Cork. Other Stokes clocks in Dublin would include the Eason's clock and Cleary's, one of the most iconic commercial clocks in the country. And I think the effort from Stokes in the shopping centre really does complement the broader kind of Victorian style of the centre. The Stokes family business on McCurtain Street in Cork is a real institution there. And at the time of the reopening of Cleary's, Philip Stokes, horologist and now owner of the family business, he noted that its hands and numerals were restored with gold leaf, its mechanical system modernised to keep it going for the next 100 years. And of course, that Cleary's clock has a particularly important place in the lore of the city. But the one in Stephen's Green, I think, is also really, really impressive. So by now, you've probably read a couple of opinion pieces on both sides of this debate. And defending Toomey's Centre, the design studio, Mortar and More, they rightly note that, like it or loathe it, it is bold in its overall design aesthetic. There's value in the detailing, which has been incorporated into its architecture, and to replicate again today would prove incredibly costly and would be unlikely to happen in our lifetime. And I do actually love a lot of the little details of Toomey's work in the centre. There are things about the centre I enjoy that came later. The 1995 arrival of the Green Gallery on the top floor. I think that's been a really good addition. Dermot O'Grady previously ran the Castle Art Gallery on South Great George's Street, and he champions the art that he likes, from the great Marky Robinson, once a familiar face on the streets of Dublin, pushing his paintings and brushes and everything else around in a shopping trolley, to the brilliant Jim Fitzpatrick. But that was one man's good idea, to use what was, up until then, an empty corridor to create an art gallery. And I think poor use of space is found in other places in the shopping centre too. I mean, the toilet situation is really far from ideal, and the top floor in general just feels a little bit lost. Some empty units were in recent years turned into an exhibition space. I'm not really sure that works. One thing that was talked about a lot in the mid-80s was the idea of a food hall that would run the length of the centre on its ground floor. I think that would have been a brilliant addition and is maybe something to be considered. Shopping centres are having a tough time of it everywhere. In America, they talk about dead malls or zombie malls. Living in the sprawl, dead shopping malls rise like mountains beyond mountains, and there's no end in sight, sang Arcade Fire. But even in Europe, shopping centres have struggled. There's fundamental change in how we shop. The internet has changed everything. Work from home means we're not in town as much as we were. Anchor department shops, that model doesn't always work either. You put a couple of big names into a shopping centre in the hope that will bring footfall for smaller shops. Some of the anchor tenants in the green have really worked out. In recent times, I think Golden Discs has been a great success. It's a large-scale unit. There's space in there for live performance, amongst other things. But smaller units in the shopping centre have always been quite transient. And the Stephen's Green Shopping Centre isn't the only example of a struggling space of its kind in the city either. It strikes me there's so much potential in the GPO Arcade, linking Henry Street and Princess Street. And if you just said, what's the GPO Arcade? Exactly. Exactly. Many people don't even know it's there. The GPO, so badly damaged by the fighting of Easter week that it only formally reopened in 1929, grew in size and stature and became in many ways more of a public building. And the arcade is a kind of handsome 1920s interior. There's a couple of little Art Deco flourishes, beautiful hanging bronze lanterns. I think they might be the originals. And it's a nice space to walk through, but it's got some closed down units. It could generally do with some better ones in places as well. And that strikes me as well as a space that needs a deep think. Going back to the 1980s, it strikes me that there was much talk about the potential of the space beyond just shopping. The idea of the food hall, getting back to that, was never really delivered upon. The gallery was a latter idea, almost a stroke of luck. And perhaps a rethink of the space as it is a better idea. But the big takeaway for me from it all is that people are passionate about the built landscape. And whether we think the centre is kitsch, brilliant, or something in between, the fact that everyone is talking about it and everyone has an opinion on it, I think is a good thing. Whenever people are inspired to voice their opinion on development in the city, to lodge appeals, to write letters and to make their case, that says the citizens are awake and paying attention. Thank you very much as ever for tuning in to that edition of the Three Castles Burning podcast. Lots more to come on the way in the near future. For now, Slán go fóill.